Hola feministas, welcome to my course project. The question I'll be talking about today is, do digital spaces provide Latinx and undocumented voices meaningful communities in response to cultural exile within the scholarly feminist spheres? I know that's a mouthful, but essentially what I'm talking about is how and why Latinx people make space for themselves online. So let's get started. Before we jump into things though, we need to understand just what Latinx is. Latinx is a gender-neutral term alternative to the terms Latino and Latina, and it emerged as early as 2014 in university settings. Spanish is a very gendered language, and usually when people refer to a group of Latinx collectively, they'll just call them all Latinos regardless of whether or not the people in that group actually identify as male. Latinx is a way to defy patriarchal language and be considerate towards gender nonconforming people. Individually, however, people are still free to self-identify as Latino, Latina, or Latinx. So essentially, it's all up to you. Another way to describe Latinx people is Hispanic or Latin. And you might hear me use those terms interchangeably because it's just something that I personally do. Additionally, a lot of people tend to mix up Latinx with Spanish people, and Latinx people are not always necessarily Spanish unless they are, of course, from Spain. So please refrain from referring to Latinx people collectively as Spanish people. There's also the term Chicano or Chicanx, and while that is an identifier for some Latinx, it's an identifier specifically for Mexican people or people of Mexican heritage or descent. So I can't personally claim to be Chicana because my family is from El Salvador, which is a different country entirely. So now you know. As for me, I have personally identified as Hispanic, Latina, Hispanic American, and Latinx interchangeably, and I want to reiterate that these terms are all up to personal preference, and you can't force someone to identify one way or the other. So now let's get into the good stuff. For as long as there have been minority groups in the United States, like Latinx, there have been people who have felt like cultural outsiders, and this is a commonly accepted fact, especially within the community. Many Latinx people, including myself, often joke about the ways that our culture clashes against the traditional American ways, but a lot of times we don't even think of ourselves as marginalized from groups that supposedly uplift marginalized people, like feminism, for example. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. So yes, we Hispanics are excluded even from feminism. Now, this isn't to say that I don't feel welcome in feminist spaces, or that there's even a code of feminist conduct that explicitly says that we're not allowed in these spaces, but there's a strong sense among scholars that Latina or Latinx feminism can't be defined within the parameters of mainstream, occasionally white feminism. Don't believe me? Well, scholar Mariana Ortega drags Simone de Beauvoir, author of the famous The Second Sex, for ignoring the diverse intersections of race. She says, "One of the most important feminist texts that articulates the experience of the other is thus shown to be inept at really capturing various aspects of otherness, in particular the experience of the Latina, whose complex identity exceeds the dominant black-white binary." As non-black people of color, Latinx are often completely ignored from feminist theory in university settings. This has definitely been my experience in school. There are famous self-identified Latina feminist theorists like Gloria Anzaldúa and Rivera Barrús who write about the Latina experience, but rarely are they canonized. In university settings, we work so hard to bridge the gap between dominant white narratives and stifle black histories that feminists often forget that people of color are not all the same, and most certainly not all people of color identify as black. This becomes especially important regarding Latinx identities because as Latinx, we embody nearly every racial group there is. Really, every racial group. Latinx can be indigenous, Afro-Latinx, or mestizo, like me. So even among ourselves, there's diversity and uniqueness. So how can university-level feminism, which is supposedly where you learn the authentic theory behind feminism, be complete without accounting for Latinx identities? Newsflash, you don't get to check off the intersectional feminist box if you only look at the black-white binary of race. It doesn't work that way. So while feminism is for everybody, rarely does that get put into practice. It leaves us Latinx in a double exile. First, we're exiled from mainstream American culture, and secondly, we're exiled from mainstream feminist culture. Scholar Pamela Redela summarizes this pretty well in saying that there is a disconnect that continues to be a barrier to a truly mass movement of women. But we're forgetting something really important, and that's undocumented voices. Now, as we'll see a bit later, not all undocumented people are Latinx, but our community is severely affected by the migration crisis. And as all Hispanic Americans once had to make their way to the States in some way, there's a sense that the plight of the undocumented falls on the shoulders of documented Latinx too. It's also impossible to ignore the fact that so much of the discrimination geared towards Latinx stems from deep-rooted xenophobia and the conflation of the Latinx identity with undocumented person. If documented Latinx are in a double exile, then those who are undocumented within our communities are in a triple exile. Because within feminism, we talk about undocumented people even less than we talk about Latinx people. And sometimes even those of us who are lucky enough to be citizens act like snobs towards our brothers and sisters simply because they couldn't take the path that we did. Undocumented issues are feminist issues though. For undocumented women in the United States, finding access to basics like healthcare are not always guarantees. Famous feminist zine Bitch wrote an article highlighting the story of Blanca Borrego, an undocumented woman who was arrested by ICE officials after being hunted down at a health clinic. Blanca is far from alone in her experience, but we don't really ever hear about these things in feminist classrooms. I wonder why. So to recap, life sucks. So what happens when you're excluded from even the most inclusive spaces? You go online. And you can bet Latinx have been already busy calling out tonterias online, left and right. Social media activism is booming right now, but for the Latinx community, digital activism can be traced back to the MySpace days. Yeah, MySpace. In 2007, police practiced their trademark brutality on a neighborhood of Latinx in LA during protests on May Day. Following the escalation, protesters used both MySpace and YouTube to share evidence of brutality and spread safe space activism methods. And undocumented activists have been able to gradually change language referring to themselves from wetback to illegal immigrant to dreamer to undocumented. Online spaces have even allowed undocumented youth to come out. And that's a phenomenon that scholar Hinda Seif has looked at and listed as something that has the potential to enhance self-determination. Coming out isn't without its dangers, however. For every story I've seen praising the courage of an undocumented youth outing themselves, I've seen horrible comments from people who take these opportunities to report innocent Americans to ICE. And we can't talk about Latinx people without talking about the shit show of an election we all survived last year. We Latinx have been using Facebook and Twitter nonstop as ways to respond to the hateful and misleading rhetoric that Trump has been spewing about our community. Stephanie Slaughter pulls a lot of great examples together. Let's look at 3. As we can see here, this Latina is using the hashtag turning ignorance around to show that Hispanics are not horrible people and that we are here to make a difference for the better. Here we have actress and activist America Ferrera tweeting about how important it is for Latinos to get out and vote and voice their opinions. And finally, we have this Latino Facebook user who speaks directly to Donald Trump, showing him that stereotypes don't apply to her or her hardworking father, who is Latino. And let's not forget the horrible things that the Democratic Party did to Latinos during the election either. Hillary Clinton, everybody's feminist queen, she made this horrible post claiming that she was relatable to all of our abuelas. Since Hillary Clinton, a rich, elite, white woman, is nothing like most Latinos abuelas, we took to Twitter in order to tell her just that. There were tons of tweets using the hashtag #NotMyAbuela that showed Hillary Clinton and her campaign how insensitive her comments were and just how different her experience is from that of our hard-working, working-class grandmothers. So, Hillary, you're nothing like my abuela. Bernie 2016. Apart from individuals flocking online, Latinx groups have also sprouted in response to lack of representation in other spaces. For example, Me Too is an online media group that creates memes, skits, and other content for Latinx people by Latinx people. They cover all sorts of topics, from favorite regional foods to crazy Hispanic mothers. But one producer at Me Too in particular is making an impact the only way she knows how, and that's through feminism. Her name is Kat Lazo, and she's a Peruvian and Colombian indigenous Latina that recently joined Me Too after leaving her very feministy YouTube channel, The Cat's Meow, which I personally used to love watching. At Me Too, she has a show called The Cat Call, where she tackles feminist issues from a Latinx perspective. There's also the Twitter account at Lexi4Prez, and this is run by Alexis Moncada, who is a bisexual Chicana activist that maintains the very popular Twitter page called Feminist Culture. You might have heard of it. She actively tweets out tons of feminist thoughts and never shies away from putting others in their place when they slander the Latinx community, documented and undocumented. Additionally, on Twitter is the account called Define American, which is run by an undocumented activist and Pulitzer Prize winner named Jose Antonio Vargas. Now, Jose is actually Filipino, but his organization benefits undocumented people from all backgrounds in order to change rhetoric and assist those who need legal assistance. So, as we've seen, Latinx identities, both documented and undocumented, fail to be accounted for within mainstream feminist thought, especially at universities. We claim to adhere to an intersectional feminism that creates a space that regards all aspects of diversity, but most of us fall way short of actually doing so. Latinos, Latinas, and Latinx are worthy of being included in feminist spaces, and our voices are worthy of being heard, but unfortunately, that's just not a reality for us yet. So, for now, we'll continue to spread our influence online, where at least we have each other to foster a meaningful community. Digital activism isn't without its hazards, but considering that other outlets, including mainstream feminism, aren't necessarily available to us, that's all we've got for now. Those are my 2 cents on the issue. For now, we've still got a lot of work to do within feminism to make sure we're inclusive for all different racial categories, but thanks for listening anyways. Hope you enjoyed and learned something. Bye!